Snow pressed against the dark windows of the Valente mansion, softening New York beneath a white silence that could not reach the grief inside. 3 days had passed since Isabella Valente had died from complications after giving birth, yet the master bedroom still carried the faint scent of her perfume. No servant dared enter unless ordered. No one had touched the pale blue robe, folded across the chair beside the bed. Adrian Valente stood in the adjoining nursery with his newborn son against his chest, staring at the child as though sheer force of will could keep him alive. At 39, Adrian was the most feared mafia boss in New York, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp cheekbones and a short, carefully trimmed beard that made his expression appear even harder than it already was. He controlled shipping routes, casino interests, and logistics companies across the city. Men twice his age lowered their eyes when he entered a room, but none of that power meant anything right now. While Luca's tiny body grew weaker in his arms, the baby had refused every bottle placed near his mouth. Luca was small, even for a newborn, with soft black hair and his mother's delicate features, but the strength of his cries had faded over the last several hours. At first, he had screamed whenever a nurse tried to feed him. Then the screaming became whimpers. By the third morning, even those sounds had almost disappeared entirely. Dr. Samuel Bennett, a silver-haired pediatric specialist with 30 years of experience, examined the infant for the 4th time that day. He was one of the few men in the mansion who spoke to Adrian without trembling, though even he chose his words carefully. Luca was dehydrated, exhausted, and losing the strength needed to feed properly. The medical team had begun supportive treatment, but the child continued rejecting the bottle, and time was becoming dangerously short. If he does not accept milk within the next few hours, his condition may become critical, Dr. Bennett said quietly, glancing at the untouched bottles lined across the counter. Some newborns respond differently to direct nursing, especially after severe distress. We need a healthy woman willing to try immediately. Adrian did not ask how much it would cost. Money was the language he used when threats were unnecessary, and he possessed enough of it to purchase almost anything in New York. He turned toward Marco Duca, his head of security, a thick-necked former army officer who had served him loyally for 17 years. "Find someone," Adrian said. His voice was low and controlled, but the hand supporting Luca's head trembled slightly. "Search every hospital, maternity center, private clinic, and agency in the city. I don't care what it costs." Within an hour, dozens of Valente men were moving through New York. They contacted private nurses, lactation consultants, recent mothers, and charitable organizations. Adrian offered enough money to change a family's life, but the answer remained the same everywhere. Some women refused the moment they heard his name. Others agreed at first, then called back after husbands or lawyers warned them what involvement with the Valente family could mean. They feared rival gangs might target them. They feared they would never be permitted to leave that world once they entered it. By late afternoon, Marco had spoken to nearly 30 possible candidates. None would come to the mansion. Adrian remained in the nursery as daylight faded behind the falling snow. He had removed his jacket, and the sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up, revealing an old knife scar along his left wrist. Luca lay against him beneath a gray blanket, too tired now even to turn his head. Adrian remembered Isabella laughing when she first felt the baby kick, remembered her placing his hand over her stomach and telling him their son would soften him. He had answered that no Valente man had ever been softened by anything. The memory cut through him with such force that he had to lower his face toward Luca's hair to hide his own expression. He had failed to save Isabella. Now he was watching their son slip away, while an entire empire waited for his commands. Across the city, Marco's youngest security lieutenant, Daniel Russo, noticed a handwritten sign in the window of a small bakery in Queens. He had been sent to question the owner after an employee at a nearby maternity clinic mentioned she had recently given birth. The bakery was called Brooks and Bread, though half the gold lettering had peeled from the glass front. Inside, a woman stood behind the counter, placing the last few loaves into paper bags. Her name was Hannah Brooks. She was 30 years old, with a soft, full figure, warm brown skin, and thick chestnut hair twisted into a loose knot. Grief had left pale shadows beneath her hazel eyes. Hannah's bakery had failed after her boyfriend emptied their shared savings account and disappeared, leaving her with unpaid rent and debts she could no longer manage. That betrayal had come only weeks after she lost her premature daughter, Grace, who had lived for less than a single day. Hannah's body had continued preparing to nourish a child who was no longer there, and every single morning had become a cruel, painful reminder of the life she had expected to hold. She had stopped answering calls from friends. She had stopped visiting her mother. She had convinced herself that everything she touched eventually disappeared. That evening, she was selling her final loaves of bread before handing the keys back to her landlord. She assumed Daniel had come to demand payment from someone she owed. Instead, he asked one quiet question. "Are you still able to nurse a baby?" Less than 40 minutes later, 3 black vehicles stopped outside the bakery. Adrian entered first, carrying Luca beneath his coat to protect him from the cold. Marco followed, then Dr. Bennett. But Hannah barely noticed the armed men or the expensive cars visible through the window. Her eyes fixed immediately on the infant's colorless face and the tiny mouth that opened without enough strength to cry. For one unbearable second, she saw Grace again beneath the hospital lights. Her knees weakened, and she gripped the edge of the counter as pain and longing ached painfully in her chest. Adrian began explaining, his voice clipped and formal, offering money, protection, anything she requested. Hannah did not ask his name. She did not ask why armed men stood outside her ruined bakery. She simply removed her apron, walked toward him, and held out both arms. "Give him to me." Adrian hesitated only once before placing Luca gently against her. Hannah carried the baby into the small office behind the kitchen, where the air still smelled of yeast and cinnamon. She sat in an old wooden chair and positioned him carefully, whispering words too soft for the man outside to hear. At first, Luca did not respond. Hannah stroked his cheek with one finger, fighting the fear that she had already arrived too late. Then the baby turned weakly toward her, found what he had rejected from every bottle, and began to drink. The sound was almost nothing, a faint rhythm in a quiet room. But Adrian heard it clearly. He stood in the doorway, with both hands hanging uselessly at his sides, as Luca continued nursing for the first time in 3 days. Hannah bent over the child, tears sliding down her face as she held him with the tenderness she had never been given the chance to give her own daughter. Dr. Bennett released a slow breath and nodded, but Adrian did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Luca's small hand curling against Hannah's sweater. The man who had buried friends, enemies, and the only woman he had ever loved finally lowered his head. Without a sound, and without attempting to hide it, Adrian Valente began to see why the time the snow stopped falling over Queens. Luca had been feeding for nearly 20 minutes, and color had slowly begun returning to his small face. Hannah remained seated in the cramped office behind the bakery, one hand supporting the baby's head while the other rested protectively across his back. Adrian stood several feet away, unable to stop watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's tiny shoulders. Dr. Bennett checked Luca's pulse twice, then quietly assured Adrian that the immediate danger had passed, though the newborn would need close observation over the next several days. Relief should have made Adrian feel stronger, but instead it left him strangely exposed. The woman sitting before him had done in minutes what his wealth, his doctors, and his entire organization had failed to accomplish. When Luca finally released Hannah and fell asleep against her chest, Adrian asked everyone else to leave the room. He waited until the door closed before speaking, his expression once again controlled beneath the sharp lines of his face. He offered Hannah a private room at the Valente mansion, full medical supervision, transportation, protection, and enough money to erase every debt connected to the bakery. His tone was formal, almost cold, because negotiation was the only way he knew how to survive vulnerability. He told her it would be temporary, perhaps only a few weeks, until Luca became strong enough to accept a bottle. Hannah looked down at the sleeping child rather than at the man making the offer. She knew the amount Adrian mentioned could restore her business and rebuild the life that had collapsed around her, but money was not what made her answer. "I'll come," she said quietly, but not because of the payment. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, unused to anyone refusing the meaning behind his offers. Hannah adjusted the blanket around Luca and finally met his gaze. She told him the baby had been dangerously weak and might reject the bottle again the moment she left. She would not walk away knowing he could die without her. Adrian studied her face for any sign of performance or hidden ambition, but found only exhaustion and the raw honesty of someone who had already lost too much. The Valente mansion stood behind iron gates on a private stretch of Long Island, a vast stone residence with tall windows and more rooms than Hannah could count. From the outside, it looked immaculate, but inside, it carried the restless disorder of a house abandoned by grief. Staff members moved quickly and spoke in whispers, constantly watching for signs of Adrian's arrival. Since Isabella's death, 3 housekeepers had resigned, and the kitchen staff had changed so often that no one seemed certain who was responsible for anything. The senior housekeeper who greeted Hannah was Teresa Marino, a compact woman in her late 50s who had served the Valente family for 3 decades. She looked Hannah over carefully, her expression suggesting she did not understand why Adrian had brought a bankrupt baker into the most guarded home in New York. Still, the moment Luca stirred against Hannah and settled again at the sound of her voice, Teresa's suspicions softened noticeably. Hannah spent the first 2 days almost entirely with Luca. She learned the rhythm of his hunger, the quiet sound he made before waking, and the way he relaxed when she placed her palm against the center of his back. Luca grew stronger with each day, and the thin cries that had frightened everyone slowly became louder and more demanding. Caring for him brought Hannah both comfort and pain. Sometimes, when his fingers closed around hers, she felt a sudden ache so deep she had to turn her face away. She knew Luca was not Grace, and she never allowed herself to pretend otherwise. But helping him survive gave purpose to the part of her that grief had left completely empty. By the 3rd morning, Hannah began noticing the disorder beyond the nursery. Breakfast trays arrived late, half the food untouched and cold. Boxes of expensive fruit spoiled in the pantry, while exhausted guards lived on coffee and packaged snacks. The kitchen itself was enormous, fitted with professional equipment, yet no one seemed to know where supplies were stored. The head cook, Emilio Costa, was a heavy-set man in his early 60s who had once run one of Manhattan's finest hotel kitchens. Since Isabella's death, Adrian had dismissed every menu as tasteless, and Emilio had gradually stopped trying at all. He prepared whatever was ordered, threw away whatever was refused, and avoided speaking unless necessary. Hannah did not ask permission to help. She began by clearing expired ingredients from the pantry and arranging the shelves so older supplies would be used first. She labeled everything in clear handwriting. When Teresa objected that Adrian had not hired her to manage the house, Hannah calmly replied that she was tired of watching good food, right while men guarding the family skipped meals. Emilio watched her work in silence until she found several unopened sacks of bread flour and asked why the mansion purchased bread from across the city every morning. He admitted that Isabella had once requested fresh bread, but after her death, no one had wanted to use the old recipes. Hannah did not touch Isabella's recipe book. Instead, she offered to teach Emilio a simple loaf she had made for years at her own bakery. Within a week, the kitchen had transformed completely. Hannah created basic menus that fed the guards according to their shifts and convinced Teresa to keep a daily inventory. Emilio's pride slowly returned as he began cooking with intention again. Together, he and Hannah mixed dough before dawn, letting it rise while the mansion was still quiet. The first morning the loaves went into the oven. The smell of warm yeast and butter drifted into the corridors, moving through the cold house more effectively than any command Adrian had ever given. Guards who usually ate, standing, began gathering near the kitchen. Men who had not exchanged more than a nod in weeks sat together at the long staff table, tearing bread apart with their hands and smiling despite themselves. Adrian noticed the changes without commenting on them directly. He returned from his offices earlier each evening, first claiming he needed updates from the doctors, then lingering outside the nursery long after Luca had fallen asleep. He began eating at home again because the meals were ready before midnight and no longer tasted like duty. More than once, he stopped in the hallway when the scent of fresh bread reached him, reminded of mornings before Isabella became ill, when she had insisted the mansion should smell like a family actually lived there. He never told Hannah that. He merely watched her move through the house with Luca in her arms, speaking to servants without fear and correcting guards as if they were stubborn customers in her old bakery. 2 weeks after Hannah entered the mansion, Luca slept for 5 uninterrupted hours for the first time. Hannah placed him in the crib and stood beside him until she was certain his breathing remained steady. When she stepped into the corridor, Adrian was waiting there, still dressed in his dark overcoat, despite having returned home nearly an hour earlier. Behind him, the mansion was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere downstairs, Emilio was preparing dough for the morning, and 2 guards were laughing softly over a late meal. Adrian looked toward the nursery, then toward Hannah, as if trying to understand how the woman no one had chosen had become the center of his home. He said nothing about it. He only removed his coat, handed it to Teresa, and walked back toward his son instead of returning to the city. Nearly a month after Hannah Brooks entered the Valente mansion, winter settled heavily across New York, covering the gardens in fresh snow, while the house itself felt warmer than it had in years. Luca had become a healthier baby, his cheeks filling out, his cries growing louder, and his tiny hands reaching instinctively toward Hannah whenever she entered the nursery. The servants no longer hurried through the corridors with frightened expressions, and even the guards standing watch at the front gates joked quietly during their meal breaks. Adrian noticed every change without ever speaking of it directly. He still spent most of his days managing shipping contracts and endless negotiations with powerful businessmen who feared him more than they respected him. But every evening he returned before Luca's bedtime, often standing silently beside the crib, watching his son sleep, convincing himself that the peace filling the mansion had finally pushed away the darkness left behind by Isabella's death. Hannah wanted to believe the same thing completely, yet something deep inside her refused to fully relax, as though some part of her instincts sensed that the quiet peace surrounding them was more fragile than it appeared. The first sign seemed too small to matter at first. One evening after feeding Luca, Hannah reached for the emergency formula stored in the nursery cabinet, intending only to check the expiration dates in case she ever became ill or temporarily unable to nurse him herself. She immediately frowned. Only 3 days earlier, she had carefully arranged every container herself, placing the newest cans behind the older ones and marking each lid with a small blue, using a kitchen marker so she could rotate supplies correctly. Now, 2 of the cans had no marks at all. Their labels were identical. Their seals appeared untouched, but Hannah was certain they were not the same containers. Years of running a struggling bakery had trained her to notice tiny inventory changes, because overlooking small details often became expensive mistakes. She said nothing to anyone. She quietly returned the cans to the shelf and decided she would check again the following morning. The next day confirmed her suspicion. The blue mark containers had changed places again, despite no one admitting to touching them. Hannah opened the cabinet carefully and examined every can under the nursery light. She could not immediately identify anything wrong with the powder itself, yet the uncertainty settled heavily in her stomach. Dr. Bennett had repeatedly explained that newborns like Luca were especially vulnerable, and introducing contaminated or altered formula could have devastating consequences. Hannah chose not to alarm Adrian before she understood exactly what she was seeing. Instead, she secretly replaced the emergency formula with newly purchased containers that only she and Dr. Bennett knew about, leaving the suspicious cans untouched inside a locked cabinet in the medical office. Dr. Bennett listened carefully as Hannah explained everything. The experienced physician remained calm, but the thoughtful expression behind his glasses grew increasingly serious as he examined the powder with his laboratory equipment. Preliminary testing showed nothing obvious, but he agreed the containers should be sent to an independent laboratory without informing anyone else inside the mansion. Whether this is sabotage or simple carelessness, he told her quietly, we cannot risk feeding this child from any container we cannot personally verify. Hannah nodded, though she already suspected the explanation would be far darker than negligence. Someone had intentionally replaced the formula without disturbing the seals, and only a person familiar with the household could have accomplished something like that. Determined to understand what was happening, Hannah began paying closer attention to the routines inside the mansion. She noticed that security cameras covering the nursery hallway occasionally experienced unexplained outages lasting only several minutes. At first, technicians blamed aging equipment, but the timing seemed too convenient. Each interruption occurred late at night, when only a handful of staff members remained awake. Hannah mentioned the pattern to Marco Duca, whose disciplined instincts immediately surfaced. Marco personally reviewed the security recordings alongside Victor Ramirez, the mansion's chief surveillance technician. Victor was a lean man who had formerly worked for a federal cybersecurity contractor, rarely displaying emotion, preferring facts over speculation. After several hours examining the system logs, Victor quietly informed Marco that the missing footage had not resulted from equipment failure. Someone with administrator-level access had deliberately erased those recordings. The discovery disturbed everyone involved, but another mystery soon deepened the unease. Hannah remembered seeing one of Luca's former temporary nannies, Melissa Grant, only a week earlier. Melissa had unexpectedly resigned after working only a few days, telling Teresa she wished to spend more time with her elderly mother. Yet when Hannah casually asked Teresa whether Melissa had collected her final paycheck, the housekeeper looked confused. Teresa admitted she had been unable to reach Melissa despite several attempts, and the address listed in her employment file belonged to an apartment that neighbors claimed had been empty for weeks. No forwarding information existed anywhere. It was as though the young woman had simply disappeared. Hannah could no longer convince herself these events were unrelated. Rather than confronting Adrian immediately with suspicions she could not yet prove, she quietly began assembling every small inconsistency she observed. She wrote dates, times, names, and unusual incidents inside a notebook she kept hidden beneath folded baby blankets. Marco secretly provided access to visitor records without asking unnecessary questions, trusting Hannah's judgment after watching her devotion to Luca over the previous month. Piece by piece, an unsettling pattern emerged. Every erased security recording coincided with visits from one particular member of the Valente family, although he rarely entered the nursery himself. Adrian's cousin, Marcus Bellini, always appeared unexpectedly on those exact days. Marcus Bellini was 45 years old, tall like Adrian but leaner, with slick-back dark hair touched by premature gray at the temples, narrow green eyes that rarely revealed his thoughts, and a perfectly tailored wardrobe that projected sophistication rather than intimidation. Unlike Adrian, whose authority rested on loyalty and decisive leadership, Marcus preferred manipulation. He smiled easily, complimented servants by name, donated generously to charities, and cultivated the image of a refined businessman overseeing several legitimate divisions within the Valente logistics empire. Behind that polished exterior, however, lay years of quiet resentment. Marcus had long believed the organization should have belonged to him after Adrian's marriage, especially because Adrian and Isabella had remained childless for so many years. Luca's birth had shattered those expectations overnight, placing an unquestionable distance between Marcus and everything he had secretly desired for himself. Victor eventually recovered fragments of deleted surveillance metadata that confirmed Marcus's security credentials had been used repeatedly to authorize restricted camera access, though the video itself remained permanently erased. Dr. Bennett also received preliminary laboratory findings from the independent facility. Trace elements inside one of the substituted formula containers suggested deliberate contamination with substances capable of causing severe intestinal illness in an infant. The report stopped short of identifying a specific poison, but the conclusion was undeniable. Someone intended to make Luca gravely ill, allowing his death to resemble a tragic medical complication rather than what it truly was. Hannah felt cold despite the warmth of the nursery as she folded the report into an envelope. She knew she had enough information to warn Adrian immediately, but before making such a serious accusation against a member of his own family, she wanted one final piece of evidence that could not possibly be questioned. That opportunity never came. One snowy afternoon, Hannah left the mansion through the service entrance, carrying a list of specialty ingredients for Emilio, insisting she would enjoy the short walk to a nearby artisan market. Marco assigned 2 guards to follow discreetly, but traffic delays separated them for only a few crucial moments when a delivery van blocked the narrow street. As Hannah turned into a quiet alley behind the market, a gloved hand covered her mouth before she could cry out. A sharp sting pierced her neck. The world blurred into white and gray, and the grocery bag slipped from her fingers, scattering oranges across the snow. By the time the guards reached the alley, only an overturned basket remained. Less than 30 minutes later, Adrian was standing in his office overlooking the frozen Hudson River when his private phone vibrated. The message contained a single photograph. Hannah sat tied to a chair inside what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, her wrists bound, but her eyes still defiantly fixed on the camera. Beneath the image were only 2 short sentences. Choose the baby or the woman. End of part 3. The harbor disappeared beneath a curtain of snow, where abandoned cranes stood like silent giants over rusting warehouses, and the icy wind carried the smell of salt and diesel. Inside Adrian Valente's mansion, however, there was no panic, only an unnerving silence. Every lieutenant who had served him long enough recognized that silence. Adrian never shouted before a war. The quieter he became, the more terrifying the outcome would be. He stood in his private office, with Hannah's photograph displayed on the polished desk, his dark eyes fixed on her bruised face and tightly bound wrists. His jaw remained still, but the muscles beneath his beard tightened with every passing second. Marco Duca waited several feet away, saying nothing. He had followed Adrian through gang wars and assassination attempts over nearly 2 decades. Yet he had never seen his employer look exactly like this. Adrian was not grieving. He was deciding how many lives would end before sunrise. The phone rang again exactly 7 minutes after the first message. Adrian answered without greeting the caller. Marcus Bellini's calm voice drifted through the speaker with chilling confidence, sounding less like a desperate conspirator than a businessman proposing a contract. Marcus reminded Adrian that the Valente Empire had survived because difficult choices were always made without sentiment. Then he repeated the question written beneath Hannah's photograph. Choose the baby or the woman. Adrian listened without interrupting, his face completely unreadable. When Marcus finished, expecting negotiation, Adrian quietly disconnected the call. He neither threatened nor bargained. He simply handed the phone to Victor Ramirez, who immediately began tracing the signal. Within minutes, Victor's fingers raced across several encrypted tracking programs before stopping on a blinking point near an abandoned shipping terminal, closed since a devastating warehouse fire 8 years earlier. Adrian glanced once at the map before fastening the buttons of his black overcoat. "We're leaving," was all he said. Word spread through the Valente organization with astonishing speed. Convoys rolled out from warehouses, logistics centers, casinos, and private security compounds scattered across the city. Hundreds of loyal men answered the call without asking why. Many had joined Adrian because he had rescued them from poverty or prison years before. They formed disciplined teams rather than reckless mobs, moving with military precision under Marco's direction. Adrian had already made his decision long before leaving the mansion. He was not coming to exchange lives. He was coming to end the conspiracy forever. Inside the abandoned warehouse, Hannah struggled to remain conscious. Her wrists were tied to a steel chair overlooking the frozen loading dock, while several armed men guarded the entrances below. Marcus Bellini stood nearby, wearing an expensive overcoat untouched by the dirt surrounding him, his polished shoes strangely clean against the cracked concrete floor. Even now, he looked composed, almost elegant, as though attending a formal business meeting instead of orchestrating murder. He told Hannah that she had complicated matters simply by caring too much about a child who was never hers. Hannah answered nothing. Fear remained lodged deep inside her chest, but it no longer controlled her. During the weeks she had spent caring for Luca, she had discovered something grief had nearly stolen from her forever. Loving another child did not erase Grace's memory. It honored it. Marcus mistook her silence for surrender. He had no idea she was quietly praying Adrian would protect Luca, even if it meant she was never found. The first explosion shattered every window along the eastern wall. Steel doors burst inward as flash grenades flooded the warehouse with blinding light and deafening noise. Marco led the first team through the smoke, giving precise commands while disciplined gunfire echoed across the empty loading bays. Adrian entered moments later, moving with frightening calm through the chaos. He carried no expression of anger, only absolute certainty. Every movement was deliberate, every decision final. The traders who attempted to retreat discovered escape routes already blocked by Valente men advancing from every direction. Years of controlling New York's ports had taught Adrian every tunnel, dock, and warehouse surrounding the harbor. Marcus had unknowingly chosen the worst possible battlefield for his plan. During the confusion, one of Marcus's surviving men disappeared into a side corridor leading toward a small room where Luca had been secretly brought to the warehouse, hidden there as leverage against Adrian. Marco had suspected Marcus might use the baby during negotiations and had ordered search teams to prioritize finding the child. But the gunman reached the room just seconds before they did. When Adrian burst through the doorway, he found the man holding Luca. Luca had awakened and was crying desperately, his frightened sobs cutting through the sound of gunfire outside. Time seemed to stop. Even Marco froze, knowing that one careless movement could end everything. Hannah saw the same scene from the opposite side of the room. After freeing one wrist against the sharp edge of the broken chair, she didn't allow herself even a second to think. She ran. The distance between her and Luca was only a few steps, but it felt endless. She threw herself forward, wrapping both arms around the baby just as the situation turned dangerous, shielding him completely with her own body. Pain shot through her shoulder in that same instant. She never loosened her grip. Instead, she curled herself completely around Luca, protecting him with every part of her body, exactly as any mother would protect her own child. The baby continued crying against her chest, alive, while she held him tightly despite her injury. That single moment became the last mistake anyone connected to Marcus ever made. Adrian crossed the room before anyone else could react, disarming the threat with brutal, controlled efficiency. Outside, the remaining traders attempted to regroup, but Valente forces overwhelmed them within minutes. Marcus fled toward the docks, hoping to reach a waiting boat hidden beyond the abandoned cranes. Marco intercepted him before he ever reached the pier. By dawn, every member of the conspiracy had either surrendered or fallen. The betrayal that had threatened Luca's life was finished completely. The harbor grew strangely quiet again, disturbed only by drifting snow settling over broken crates and abandoned equipment. Paramedics rushed toward Hannah as soon as the building was secured, but Adrian reached her first. She remained seated on the cold concrete floor, pale from the strain of the ordeal, yet refusing to let anyone take Luca until she knew for certain he was safe. Adrian gently lifted the baby into Marco's waiting arms before kneeling beside her. For several long seconds, he simply looked at the woman who had twice placed herself between his son and danger, without ever asking for anything in return. Hundreds of Valente soldiers, guards, drivers, and lieutenants stood watching in complete silence. None of them had ever witnessed Adrian display affection in public, not even toward Isabella during their marriage. Without caring who saw, Adrian slipped one arm carefully around Hannah's uninjured shoulder and pulled her into his embrace. She leaned against him, exhausted, while the snow drifted through the shattered warehouse roof above them. Adrian slowly turned to face every loyal member of his organization, still gathered across the harbor. His voice was calm, but it carried effortlessly through the frozen morning air. "From this day forward," he said, holding Hannah securely beside him, "anyone who disrespects her disrespects the Valente family." No one answered, because no answer was necessary. Every man present understood that the declaration meant far more than simple gratitude. In the eyes of Adrian Valente, the woman nobody had chosen had just become someone his entire empire would protect, without question. That a full year later, winter returned to New York, covering the city's rooftops with fresh snow, while the Hudson reflected pale morning light instead of the darkness that had once surrounded the Valente name. Much had changed since the night of the harbor rescue. Marcus Bellini's betrayal had shattered the last illusion that power alone could protect a family, and Adrian Valente had spent the following months reshaping both his empire and himself. One by one, businesses connected to violence disappeared behind legitimate companies that expanded the logistics network, modernized shipping terminals, and developed legal international trade routes. The casinos operated under transparent licensing. Former warehouses became distribution centers, and thousands of employees now earned honest livelihoods through enterprises that no longer depended on fear. Newspapers that once described Adrian as the city's most untouchable mafia boss gradually replaced those headlines with stories about a mysterious businessman investing millions into neighborhoods long abandoned by other investors. People still lowered their voices whenever the Valente name was mentioned, but the fear that had once defined it slowly gave way to something closer to respect. Hannah Brooks recovered completely from the injury she sustained that night, although a narrow scar remained across her left shoulder as a quiet reminder of the choice she had made that snowy morning. She never tried to hide it. Instead, she accepted it as proof that love sometimes demanded courage before certainty. Adrian had insisted she could remain in the mansion forever, yet Hannah gently refused to allow grief or comfort to define the rest of her life. She wanted to build something with her own hands again, not because she needed independence from Adrian, but because baking had always been the language through which she expressed hope. With Adrian's financial support offered only as a private loan, she insisted on repaying. The abandoned bakery in Queens opened its doors once more. Above the freshly restored windows hung a new wooden sign carved in elegant gold lettering, Little Luca Bakery. Hannah chose the name without asking Adrian first, because she knew exactly who had given her the strength to begin again. The little boy she had once saved had unknowingly rescued her from becoming a prisoner of her own sorrow. The bakery quickly became unlike any other in the neighborhood. Warm light spilled through the front windows before sunrise every morning, and the scent of butter, cinnamon, and fresh bread drifted down the snow-covered sidewalks long before customers arrived. Hannah personally greeted everyone who entered, remembering names and favorite pastries with the same quiet kindness that had once transformed the cold atmosphere inside the Valente mansion. Mothers often gathered there after walking their children to school. Elderly couples lingered over coffee instead of rushing home. Construction workers stopped by before their shifts simply because Hannah insisted everyone deserved a hot breakfast to start their day. Above the register hung a small framed photograph of a sleeping infant wrapped in a blue blanket. No caption explained its meaning. Those who knew the story never needed one. Every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, a familiar black car stopped outside the bakery. Adrian never sent drivers inside with Luca. Instead, he parked, stepped onto the sidewalk, and carried his son to the front door himself. Luca was now a lively 1-year-old with thick black hair, bright gray eyes inherited from Isabella, and an endlessly curious smile that seemed to erase every trace of the loneliness surrounding his earliest days. The moment Adrian opened the bakery door, Luca would stretch both arms toward Hannah before his father could even speak. His tiny legs kicked impatiently until Adrian lowered him to the floor, and the little boy always toddled as quickly as he could across the wooden boards into Hannah's waiting embrace. She never encouraged the habit or called him toward her. She simply opened her arms, and somehow he always knew exactly where he wanted to go. Adrian watched the same scene every morning without interruption, slowly realizing that love freely chosen always carried more meaning than loyalty demanded by fear. Their relationship had grown steadily during that year, built quietly through shared responsibility and mutual respect rather than grand romantic gestures. Adrian visited the bakery often beyond the morning drop-offs, sometimes staying to help Hannah close up in the evenings, sometimes simply sitting quietly at a corner table while she worked, content just to be near her and Luca both. One snowy afternoon, Adrian invited Hannah to attend the public inauguration of the Valente Foundation for Single Mothers, a charitable organization established in Isabella's memory to provide emergency housing, child care assistance, lactation support, medical care, job placement, and financial counseling for women facing the kind of despair Hannah herself had once endured. The ceremony took place inside a beautifully restored historic library overlooking Bryant Park, where television cameras, newspaper reporters, civic leaders, and hundreds of invited guests filled the grand hall. Among them stood Mayor Eleanor Hayes, a distinguished woman known for placing practical solutions above political theater. Though she and Adrian had spent years negotiating difficult issues surrounding his businesses, she openly acknowledged that the foundation represented one of the most significant private investments ever made for struggling mothers across New York. No one in attendance expected the event to become something far more personal. After concluding his formal remarks about opportunity, responsibility, and rebuilding lives. Adrian unexpectedly stepped away from the podium instead of returning to his seat. The room gradually fell silent as he walked directly toward Hannah, who stood near the front, holding Luca in her arms. Reporters instinctively raised their cameras, assuming another announcement was coming, but Adrian ignored every lens pointed in his direction. He stopped only when he stood before Hannah. For a brief moment, the powerful businessman who had commanded thousands of employees and once controlled the city's criminal underworld seemed to search for words far more carefully than he ever had during negotiations worth millions of dollars. Then, before the entire audience, Adrian slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Curiously, he did not reach into his pocket for a ring right away. Instead, he looked first at Luca, then into Hannah's tear-filled eyes. His voice remained steady, yet everyone present could hear the emotion beneath every word. "The day you saved Luca," he said quietly, "you saved me too." He paused, allowing the silence to settle gently over the room before continuing. "You never replaced his mother. No one ever could. Isabella will always be part of his life, and I will make sure he grows up knowing the extraordinary woman who gave him life." Adrian swallowed before speaking again, the honesty in his expression replacing every trace of the feared mafia boss the city had once known. "But you became the mother that he chose." At that exact moment, as if the little boy somehow understood every word, Luca turned toward Hannah and reached up to touch her cheek with one tiny hand. Then, in a soft, uncertain voice, still learning the language of the world, he smiled and whispered, "Mama." The single word echoed through the silent hall with greater power than any applause could have carried. Hannah covered her mouth as tears spilled freely down her face. For so long, she had believed motherhood had ended forever beside a hospital bed where Grace had taken only one day of breath. She had never expected life to offer her another path, nor had she ever tried to claim one that was not hers. Yet this little boy, through nothing more than the innocent certainty of his own heart, had answered a question she had never dared ask herself. Adrian finally reached into his pocket and removed a simple diamond ring, sliding it gently onto her trembling finger as she nodded through her tears. The hall erupted into applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the chandeliers overhead. Guests rose to their feet one after another until every person in attendance stood clapping, including reporters who had momentarily forgotten to remain impartial. Mayor Hayes wiped discreetly at the corner of one eye before joining the standing ovation, while Dr. Bennett, Teresa, Marco, Emilio, Victor, and dozens of familiar faces from the Valente household smiled with the quiet satisfaction of people who had witnessed impossible healing unfold over the previous year. No victory over rivals, no business triumph, and no display of power had ever earned Adrian the kind of respect filling the room in that moment. It had been won instead by compassion, sacrifice, and the courage of a woman who once believed she had nothing left to give. As evening settled over New York, the celebration came to an end. Adrian carried Luca while Hannah walked beside them, her hand resting naturally in his. As they stepped into the waiting car, snow drifted gently through the glowing city lights, while the vehicle moved slowly along familiar streets that had once symbolized power, fear, and isolation. People on the sidewalks glanced toward the passing car with mild curiosity, never realizing they were watching far more than the vehicle of a powerful businessman. Inside sat a little boy asleep between the two people he loved most, a woman who had rediscovered motherhood through selfless compassion, and a man who had finally learned that the greatest empire he would ever build was not measured by wealth or influence, but by the family waiting for him each time he came home. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a warm, steady rhythm for all three of them. Hannah continued running her bakery each morning, greeting neighbors and friends with the same quiet kindness that had once transformed a grieving mansion into a home again. Adrian restructured his remaining business interests further, ensuring that everything he built moving forward reflected the values Hannah had shown him were possible even within his complicated world. Luca grew steadily, surrounded by people who loved him fiercely and without condition. He knew nothing yet of warehouses, kidnappings, or the dangerous betrayal that had once threatened his life. He knew only warm bread in the mornings, his father's steady presence each evening, and the woman who had chosen to love him completely, without ever needing to be asked twice. Hannah often thought back to that snowy evening in her failing bakery, when a desperate man had walked through her door carrying a dying baby, asking for something she never expected to give again. She had lost so much in those difficult months before that night: her daughter, her business, her sense of who she was supposed to become. Yet somehow, through the deepest grief she had ever known, she had found her way back to purpose, to love, and to a family she never could have imagined for herself. Sometimes the greatest gifts arrive wrapped in the most unexpected pain. Hannah believed she had lost everything the day she lost Grace. But love, once given freely and without condition, always finds its way back, sometimes through the smallest hands reaching out in the dark, asking simply to be held.